Eric Roberts, what a pleasure to connect with you, to re-engage with you, and to sit down to talk about incredibly deep philosophical things with you.
Well, I'm excited too, so that should be fun. Looking
Um,
forward to it.
so, Me too. So, for context, I've been doing the rounds with former professors and getting to revisit some of the subjects I learned in class. And this is an
Mhm.
exception because this is a class that I didn't take. But
Right.
as an avid, hardcore fan of science fiction and philosophy, it is a subject that is very near and dear to my heart. And the subject for today is utopia. So why don't we begin by establishing something for everybody? Um, how unexpectedly vast is utopian literature?
Oh, utopian literature is huge, particularly when you try to understand its dynamic range historically. It goes, you can find it way back in antiquity and, all the way through. There is a site of utopian literature that's generally considered definitive. And I sent it to you. I can't remember the total number of works that are there, but it's, on the order of tens of thousands, which means that there's no easy way to approach it, just, to do it comprehensively. And one of the reasons that I put together the website about more general utopias and not just the technologically oriented ones that we covered in our class was to give people a guide through the different possibilities that were available.
I was very surprised. I saw the site you sent me, and it's around 12,000.
Yeah.
So apparently, there's something in the human psyche that yearns for an optimal society, echoing through the years. How
Well,
would you
and I
characterize?
think it's important to say it doesn't, it's not necessarily achievable. I mean, one of the criticisms that utopia comes in for is that, there can be no perfect society. And I think that's a defensible position. But on the other hand, in order to get a better society, you have to imagine what the qualities of such a society would be. And utopian literature, I think, is one of the best ways of trying to find what those characteristics are.
And well, I guess this perfectly segues into my next question, which was how do these characteristics often get portrayed in literature?
Well, I mean, I think in many different ways. There are interesting characteristics of most utopias that I suppose, fit into understanding of the genre. Most of them contrast the current world with some alternative vision. If you go back to Thomas More's Utopia, which gave
Mhm.
Utopia its name, um, the beginning, it's in two parts. And the first part of Utopia is really a critique of the society in 1514 that Thomas More is living in. And the second part is a description of this island that Raphael Hisliday has described, where things are different. And
Hmm.
so it's in the comparison of a modern time, the current time, with some alternative that you get that sense of a utopian vision.
Yeah, I see. And this is something that happens in Bellamy too, and looking backward, right? The thinking about the future, thinking about the past. Um, and I guess
Well,
go for it.
I was just going to say, Utopia is well known to people. I mean, that book, even if they haven't read it, people know of that book. But Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward is surprisingly little known.
Hmm.
That book was one of the most popular books of the 19th century, written in 1887. Um, it, I think, outsold all but two novels by Americans in the 1970s, Ben-Hur and Uncle Tom's Cabin. Um, and it's never gone out of print. It's been translated into thousands of hundreds of languages, and it just everywhere. People think about these things. Looking backward is that example, and as you noted, it contrasts the Boston of 1887, the current world. It's a satire or a critique of the existing society, with, in Bellamy's case, this future world, now, well behind us in the past of the year 2000, but unimaginably far ahead from 1887, in which the nation is in much better hands. And it's in literary terms, I don't think that Bellamy, can touch even Moore's Utopia or some of the other books that we read in the class. But in terms of ideas and their persistence, I think it was a wonderful choice. We When it became an introduction to the humanities course, after a couple of years of being a freshman seminar, pretty much immediately we stopped reading Looking Backward in its entirety, because there were better books out there, but we always had some piece of it.
Yeah, it was very difficult to narrow down a selection of books to talk about today.
Yeah.
Just I could spend an hour talking about just what the Industrial Army, but I think it's worth taking a moment to do the bird's eye view, and thinking of Utopia as the perfect society implicitly requires that we talk about defining what is good, and
Right.
and and sort of like coming to terms with the evolution of moral philosophy, so that we can have a framework to then at least like feel familiar with these visions. Why don't we start with the grandfather of them all, Plato,
Mm-hmm.
and talk about a little bit of what principles of justice, morality, virtue existed in at his time.
And Plato was where we began. There, in the Reader, there were 3 books of the Republic, so that we extended our historical sweep back to classical times in Greece. Um, I think for most philosophers over the lifetime, the idea is that in that perfect society, the leadership of the society has to transcend personal gain. That you look around a society, and the people who seem to be succeeding most are, oftentimes the ones who are most selfish or most powerful. And so in Plato's Republic, he specifically gets rid of the idea that leadership should be through force and of arms or power, and promotes the notion of a philosopher king, someone who could be could lead a society for the good of all its people, and not just for um, the leader
Mhm.
on that on their own. Um, and you see that. I mean, Plato describes his republic you know, in terms that you can't always follow. There's a fascinating book,
Mhm.
which or trilogy, about what happens if we try to set up a utopia along today along the Platonic lines, by Joe Walton. Um, and it doesn't all work out, of course, because there are contradictions in all utopian ideas. But it's interesting to extrapolate and see what might come from those starting points. One of the interesting features of Plato's Utopia and Republic that comes up again in some of the other stories that we read, um, is the idea that birth should not trump, the personal qualities of that leader. People from all different backgrounds should be able to rise into that category of philosopher king, which is certainly an unusual idea in the years that Plato is writing.
Yeah, and I think like if we think of ourselves as if we take the Hobbesian Darwinian approach to what societies tend to be and the tribalism and egoic identities, it is a pretty powerful breakthrough. And
Mhm.
even formalizing concepts such as instrumental good versus intrinsic good,
Which,
where
of course, the technological visions of Utopia counted for the university requirement in ethical reasoning. And so one of the things that we did include was a little background in classical ethical theory, which generally attributed more to Aristotle than to Plato, and his notion of intrinsic good versus instrumental good, with the classic intrinsic good being happiness and the classic instrumental good being money. Money is, might be able to get you things that made you happy, but doesn't do anything in itself. And Aristotle also, Nicomachean Ethics, uh, takes this idea of virtue as the key to the ethical world, where a virtue theory where there are intrinsically virtuous actions, an idea that will be re-explored in Kant, um,
Mhm.
uh, in the deontological theories that he pioneers, which is in contrast, and we talk about this
Mhm.
specifically, the ethical theories of consequentialism, utilitarianism, greatest good for the greatest number, where we read excerpts from both Bentham and Mill. But reading the philosophy is not easy for people to get a good sense of it. I've thought one of the
Mhm.
great things about the class was that people can tie into those concepts much more easily by looking at literature. And
Mhm.
there's a short story by Ursula Le Guin, The Ones That Walk Away from Amalas, which is a very short, about 4 pages long, piece that's a refutation of pure utilitarianism. Um, and it's so effective.
Mhm.
I encourage people to take that reading and read it aloud with their roommates. It's so moving in such a short piece. And you can see it. And then we would talk in lecture about how that would come up um, in other forms of even current media. I guess this was after the whole I'm sorry, this is after the Stanford class finished, but when I would teach ethics at either Reed or Willamette, when I was teaching after I retired from Stanford, you know, the example that just jumps out at you is Thanos in
Mhm.
the Avengers pair of movies, where he argues very calmly that the entire universe is better off if you would just kill off half the people or half the beings. That you have some gigantic number of miserable beings. Well, but they're competing for resources. You make it, you cut down the competition, and everybody's happier. And he articulates that very clearly and soberly. But
Mhm.
it's an idea that everyone, of course, rejects, or at least certainly the Avengers do.
No, it's fascinating, and there's the added layer of it that he thinks that he adds a justice component because of randomness. That he says it's
Yes.
not selective. There's no favorites here. It's just a roll of the die. Um,
Hmm.
no, but it's fascinating because these ideas keep coming up, and one of the themes that I've been trying to explore is lately, especially post pandemic, I think that the landscape of media contains a lot of pessimism about the future, and I
Yes.
think reclaiming a positive view of the future is the only way we could ever hope to get anywhere toward whatever we can convene as progress. So part of this conversation to me is a long arc of trying to revalue why it's worth imagining a better society. And we talked about the republic a little bit, and there's no way to condense this into a measurable, amount of time. But I had an interview a few weeks ago where a comment came up that was, yeah, the allegory of the cave is the original Matrix movie, and and so like to just to give a sense for how we're never going to do the republic justice. But we do want to keep moving because this is something that happened a very long time ago, and it wasn't the thing that actually named the genre. The genre name comes much later from Thomas More as he was critiquing, the 1500s and his society. Um, and he does something that I think is pretty cool with the wordplay in naming Utopia. Do you want to elaborate a bit on the wordplay in the
Well,
story?
utopia has two derivations from the Greek. It could either be EU, as it's usually transliterated, which would make it the good place, or just the single U, which would indicate no place, a place that doesn't exist. But it is both of those things. It's nowhere and the ideal place. And by keeping that sort of double entendre in his word, I mean, you get a chance to explore it in a way that you realize that it doesn't exist. So you're not tied to some specific vision, but you get to talk about things that do matter. And there's no question that the utopia that More describes, at least in my mind, is so preferable to the England he critiques in part one. That they have fixed many things up, and they're and you have lots of very modern ideas. I mean, there's much more gender equality in Utopia than in that time. The idea that much of the work that is done is completely unnecessary. It's really just the particularly in the aristocracy and the social climbing, there's and the military, you get all of this wasted effort, an idea that will recur in economic analyses throughout
Mhm.
history. But I found it you know very exciting to read, and of course both just going back to your comment about being able to think about utopia in this time when a lot of the writing and certainly a lot of sort of the social zeitgeist is of a negative future. I'm hearing that more and more. How do you imagine that better world? I think both Plato and More and Bellamy, I guess all of them, are able to do that very effectively in their writings, which are the ones that we start with. But a through line through the course, one of our attempts to sort of ask a general question over the entire time of the quarter was why, if after all, technology is deployed in the service of humankind, why is it that as technology advances, that the literary visions of the ideal society become darker, more dystopian, less utopian, and I think that carries through. You can find some counter examples, and we would read some of those from time to time. But I think there's no question that the overall pattern is there. That as we've advanced, at least in terms of our understanding of technology and science, we're a little more fearful of the future. I mean, the fear today around both the erosion of democracy around the world, about what AI will do to us. All of these, and in the wars that are going on now around the world. Sometimes hard to see where that ideal future is coming from. One of the books that I found particularly useful intellectually and in teaching the course, in its later years, we had moved on from that to a different story, but was Marge Piercy's Women on the Edge of Time. It's comes from sort of the heyday of American second wave feminism. It's unique in that its an explorer of the utopian world is not someone from sort of the high end of society, but a downtrodden Latina woman who's abused. But what she has is this sensitivity to other people, which in the story, the science fiction aspect of the story, allows people from the future to contact her. And so she has these conversations and virtual visits with the utopian future of that time. But the piece that was, I thought, quite interesting about Woman on the Edge of Time is that future is not fixed. That sometimes when Connie visits the future, she can wind up in the dystopian future, which is the one where people make different choices in our time that lead to different futures. It's all, at a knife edge, and we need to make sure that we push it in the right direction because the universe is chaotic and changes in the initial conditions can have enormous impact down the road. So that worked out really well as one of the readings. I think when in the seminar version, we read a lot more than we did in the Introduction to the Humanities course, because the IHUM board had rules about how many major texts you could have in order not to overwhelm people with backgrounds that didn't have as much reading in them. But when I was teaching the seminar, sort of planning for the IHUM class, I said, well, let's read twice as much and see which things people like. And people didn't always like Woman on the Edge of Time or Looking Backward as great literature, but those were the two top novels and that people thought we would get the most out of in order to understand this utopian principle.
That's so interesting, and I think there's one minor point and a major point that I want to echo. That is, science fiction in general, and its relationship to literary inclinations. Even some of the biggest names in the genre, like Asimov. I mean, literary, pretty straightforward writing, not too much in the way of prose. Um, However, in terms of ideas, um, there's what you get, and also a pretty wide distribution from the very mundane to the very mind blowing. But you reacted to that, so I want to.
Well, that's certainly an idea that many people have. I mean, in English departments, there are, of course, science fiction courses now, but generally, I think the attitude is that the writers aren't as good, although, there are some wonderful science fiction writers who have both those literary strengths and the intellectual, I mean, the imaginative future world building that you see. Um, I don't know. I just reread this summer the science fiction works of the sort of mid 20th century British writer John Wyndham. And they're marvelously crafted as novels as well. And so you see that in some. I mean, Asimov, doesn't do a great deal of character development in any of his
Mhm.
stories, really. They are these ideas, and trying to play with ideas. I think, for example, Ursula Le Guin
Mm.
does a marvelous job of. I mean, when we stopped teaching the Woman on the Edge of Time, Marge Piercy book, it was replaced by Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed, which has the subtitle An Ambiguous Utopia,
Mhm. Mhm.
uh, and is much more thought provoking than many of the other stories that we read. We often, for example, read at least parts of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein
Mm.
uh, because it was, I mean, there's a great piece of writing. I'm just going to break off for a second. Somehow my
Oh,
phone,
yeah, no problem.
I should turn that off, but let me just see. I can't imagine I need this. Anyway, let that go.
um, um, no, science fiction changed my life. I wouldn't be the person I am without it. But the
Well, what were
major
your
point,
favorites?
my
Just so we
favorites,
can.
I love Philip K. Dick. Um,
Yes,
I love
another great
his
idea.
great idea, man. I love. I'm a huge fan of Asimov. There's a short story called "The Last Question." I don't know if you've read it.
Yes,
Um,
the yes, I've read it. Yes, and
that single handedly changed my future. That story, was a marker in my life that gave me license to dive deep into these ideas. And then
yes,
I read Foundation during the pandemic for the first time, and that
and
had a balming effect. A calm amidst the uncertainty that these patterns occur, that we've been through these before, that'll happen again. um,
and the
I
whole idea
love.
of history is powerful, right? That you
Yes.
can't necessarily predict, all of the individual changes, or there, but the trend line is predictable, and of course, that's how the story of Foundation works out. That the psychohistorians are unable to predict certain aspects of, the appearance of the mule, for example.
Hmm.
Uh, and it's for that reason that you need the second foundation. You need,
The backup of the
psychohistorian,
backup.
right? Backup plan here. I mean, that was a very powerful story for
Hmm.
me. Um,
Um, and then more my recent space opera that I've really come to adore is the Expanse series by
mhm,
James S. A. Corey. Um,
mhm.
and I think it walks the line between optimistic and pessimistic and individual versus societal quite well. Um, and the writing is compelling. I really like his tone. I love Christopher Nolan too. I know he doesn't write books, but some of his ideas I've always thought were um, uh, really
Mhm.
powerful. Inception, even Tenet, which is I think his most esoteric film, is just a masterpiece of plot crafting. Um, I don't know if you're familiar with the story, but the the
That one
main
I know,
gimmick.
exception, but didn't see.
So the main gimmick that he uses is that there is a device that allows you to go backwards in time, but not point to point jumping. It reverses the direction of time. Uh,
Hmm.
and so you're reasoning circularly through the events of the story. Because of course, like someone goes forward, then goes backward, then you get into this really crazy narrative yoga. Um, and um, but anyway, I don't want to get. I could talk about sci-fi for hours. The big point that I wanted to talk about with Utopia, and the name Utopia being the good place and nowhere at the same time, reminds me a lot of the Platonic ideals and the even the allegory of the cave. Like there are these perfect forms. We don't have access to them, but we should strive for them anyway. And
Yes.
in the context of the Renaissance, where more was, like Europe was going through this fundamental shift, I think
Right.
we.
Moore is really at the front end of that for in England. I mean, it will the Renaissance will move on from there,
Oh,
and
100%. But in the
right.
in the I mean in these echoing of the classical ideas that then get formally rediscovered and implemented institutionally. I think there's something similar going on today too, where there is like a reach backward in time to find what are the most precious gems that we can, build a foundation out of, and reacquainting ourselves with classical ideas is one of them. And personally, I just discovered Neoplatonism, and as a philosophy, I think it's an exciting one to reclaim in these times to think about the future. And also, it's a good chance to talk about how these tectonic changes in society reflect so many layers of the types of ideas discussed. And so, if
Mhm.
we move forward a couple hundred years, the next big work that was a standout, I definitely raised my eyebrows when seeing it in the syllabus, is the Communist Manifesto, um,
Mhm.
and painting it as a vision of utopia. First of all, how did you arrive at the conclusion that this was a text worth examining as a vision?
Well, it certainly has that quality of critiquing society as it stands, and positing the possibility of another society. Engels is a master writer, so it reads well, and it's also extremely short. Um, the other point about it was that people don't know what it is, right? I mean,
Mm.
I think I had an interesting reaction. It was in the syllabus, I think, throughout the history of the class. I don't think it ever disappeared. Um, it was just one of the readings that we put in the reader. Um, in the 90s, when it was a seminar, um, there were a number of people who objected to reading it. It was considered, well, why would you put that on the list? It's political indoctrination to have us read that. Uh, and we're not endorsing it. We're just this is a set of ideas. And but after that, increasingly people were rediscovering it anew. They said, is that what the Communist Manifesto
Mm.
talks about? Well, that's pretty interesting, right? um, and usually Rob Robinson, my partner in the teaching of the class, would give the lecture on the manifesto. We both felt very much that it should be there as a way of partly segueing to the creation that idea that you could build utopias that existed in the real world, an idea that
Mm.
comes out of the European experience of the 19th century. All the upheavals in 1848, the Paris Commune later, all of this um, sort of revolutionary fervor. I mean, which I suppose you can date back to the um, American Revolution,
Mm.
1776, and the French Revolution in 1789. And I know when we talked about those historical bits, looking at how they influenced each other, that, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen are very close to the Declaration of Rights in the Bill of Rights. And that's because they wrote to each other, right? These are not events, and that, the U.S. ideas, would influence the French ideas a decade and a half later. And so that was fascinating. And then, particularly in the 19th century, a whole group of particularly French utopian writers and thinkers wrote model utopian stories that they then tried to put into operation, usually in the New World. So you have Cabet, who writes Voyage to Icaria and then tries to set up Icarian in the sort of Midwestern expansion frontier of the United States. People got really excited about these ideas in France. And so Fourier, Cabet, a few non-French counterparts with that. I mean, people were building real utopias. The Oneida communities in the United States were sort of long-running examples. You see, several people putting those communities together. And I think that looking at the Communist Manifesto gives people an idea, because, of course, that was such an influential text, that yes, writers have an enormous effect, not necessarily positive, but on the way people think about these things and what's seen as possible when it gets in.
And
Go
it's
ahead.
also I think it's the industrial age is so fascinating to me because it's the first time that public education gets a massive outlet, and so history gets redefined to fit the industrial mold at the time, and sort of the Communist Manifesto arises in this time, also at the moment when the larger poles of the world are forming. Right, like these are the large scale world wars or the great superpowers, but you start folding these. Let's call them cognitive attractors of ideas and polarization, and society all of a sudden has better ways to communicate or faster ways to communicate, and so action gets taken more expediently, and ideology grabs hold also more expediently as well. And I was one of those people who grew up in a Latin American country with, and I was born the same year that democracy was born in Paraguay, after
Mhm.
something like 36 years of a military dictatorship,
Yeah.
U.S. sanctioned, and so the landscape was very conservative and very capitalistic, and the Communist Manifesto is absolute poison, right, in that type of environment. So it wasn't until actually reading the words that I found myself being like, oh, wait, oh my gosh. So there's a foundational text that is actually tiny. And then there's like giant institutions built on top of that may choose to adhere to or disadhere to from the principles therein. And so it was a very eye-opening moment to me, like personally crossing the threshold and saying, okay, I'm willing to read this. And Capital first, actually. I read Capital first and then the Communist Manifesto, and I thought, wow, Capital is definitely in the common discourse not well understood. Um,
Right.
and okay, so now we have this setting of, wow, we can build the utopia into the real world, and I think this is the time to talk a little bit more about looking backward, because as you said, it's not a very well known book, and I think the value there is actually quite interesting, and I think it has a lot of this techno grunge, let's call it. It's like it has
Well,
a
it's the perfect book for this class, which was trying to look at the relationship between the progress of technology and utopian visions.
mhm.
Um, Prior to that, you don't have much technology. There's the unfinished Bacon story, The New Atlantis, um, in which he describes an island utopian society that's based on, you know, science and technology such as it is in that day. You know, it's pseudoscience and much of it
Mhm.
as we see it now. But at least the idea that those ideas and that the study of the world would liberate us and give us new potential, you know, comes up there. But you know, you can't sort of try to graft that on to modern society in the way that I think is still possible from um, the time that Bellamy is writing, where you can imagine. I mean, one of the sort of most memorable pieces of the book is that Bellamy's traveler, who starts out in 1887 and is a industrialist on top of the world and believes in all the things that he's been taught about capitalism and the, you know, right to rule of the wealthy, discovers all of the contradictions waking up in the year 2000. But the that wonderful idea that, you know, in 1887 when it rains everyone puts up their own personal umbrella, but in the Boston of the year 2000, you know, umbrellas get rolled out over the sidewalks. You know, it's all shared and it's much more effective and everyone gets one and you're protected from the elements equally well. And looking backward has a huge number of anticipation as of ideas. You can find radio there. Um, I don't know if you looked at the little video that's attached to um, the lecture that I give on looking backward, which talks about how Stanford had a radio pioneer who was absolutely influenced by looking backward to create some of the early radio programs in the area before radio became widespread. So it had that powerful motivational push to take ideas from literature and build them into the world. Bill Gates's father, Bill Gates Sr., who ran the foundation for a long time, wrote a book with a co-author whose name I'm blanking on right now, but you know we could look it up. Um, is that in response to the proposed elimination of inheritance taxes, in which Gates Sr. argues strongly that you need inheritance taxes. And in the center of the book, you know, just waxes lyrically about how wonderful Bellamy's utopian vision is and how he wants that to reestablish that equality. And so you even for people in, you know, certainly our modern world, the second half of the 20th century and beyond, have taken Bellamy's ideas and seen fit to, even if they don't know that they were Bellamy's ideas. I should mention, I don't, you know, we never read it, but in the class, I think I included one of the parable of the water tank in the reader, but Bellamy, 10 years after writing Looking Backward, wrote an update called Equality, in which he sort of fleshed out all of the pieces, because by that time there were Bellamy societies all over the world that were really looking to create those times.
And how does equality? What are some of the highlights there in terms of, you know, giving people a feel for what that society looks like?
Well, you mentioned the Industrial Army.
Hmm.
I mean, that I find, you know, the whole construction of that. How do you apportion work? This is, in some sense, the classic economic question. Um, you know, in ancient times, you know, the ruler did it. The ruler
Hmm.
forced everyone to do particular jobs, and you know, or jobs are inherited, and you know, a particular family or a particular caste does something, and Plato was one of the first to question that idea, is that will there be possibilities of social mobility? But it never got that idea that you could somehow um, have a system that wasn't forced on you. Um, Capitalism is, the first real change in, that, coming from feudalism, that, okay, well, we take the ideas that Adam Smith has in Wealth of Nations, that people work because they have a self-interest, but collectively, that moves us in a better direction in that model.
Mhm.
Adam Smith is, if you look at most of what he wrote, I mean, certainly the theory of moral sentiments, he would be a communist by modern standards. He's, the idea that he's the paragon of capitalist history is certainly not the case. Um, but that idea that somehow the invisible hand can organize work, um, was a major change in the way people progressed. And so, if you imagine that you had something where you don't have that economic incentive, and that's true for Bellamy's Utopia, how do you get people to do the jobs that no one wants to do? And one of the things that I found just marvelously creative about Bellamy's in industrial army, everyone is part of the industrial army, and must work in order to advance the society, nowhere near as much as one works in today's society, for exactly the same reason that Moore talks about in Utopia, that there's a dead weight loss from most of the people who are being non-productive. Uh, Interesting. Keynes thought the same thing. In writing in the 20s, John Maynard Keynes thought that in the future, people would only need to work 15 hours a week because
Mhm.
technology and all the other things that we've put together, the growth in efficiency and productivity, would mean that we could sustain ourselves on much less than 40 hours. Those ideas are there in spades in Bellamy, and but how, some jobs are attractive, some aren't, and in Bellamy's world, the idea is you make a market there. You have, the jobs that no one wants. Well, you run down the number of hours until someone wants it. Right? You're essentially bidding on, oh, okay, I'll do that as long as I don't have to do very much of it, as opposed to our world where the, least attractive jobs often pay the least, and therefore, people who are in them have to work multiple copies of that job, or just suffer these indignities, and that is pushing everything in the wrong direction. So
Reminds
that
me
was
a
one
little
of
bit of the. It's so interesting, and it reminds me a little bit of the Amel's criticism of utilitarianism as well, right? Like, what if you had one soul destined to hell so that everybody else could be saved? Um, would you be willing to make that deal? Um,
yeah,
and okay, so that I think is like exciting ideas about the future. Very compelling visions about what society could look like. It gets really interesting, as you said, in like industrial, post-industrial world where we have the power to enact these, and pretty quickly the picture turns dire. I
yes,
want to skip forward a little bit to the what I think are the two classics of dystopian future, 1984 and Brave New World.
right.
Um, and one
The,
thing that
Go ahead.
phenomenologically was interesting to me in terms of science fiction was that these works, for the first time, instead of contrasting it from a present society to a future society, I got to experience them contrasting the present society to a previous version of what utopia could be, or dystopia could look like. Okay, that was my preface of it, and I want you to run with it as the two main flavors of dystopia that we know.
Well, we always talked about both of them, and they're interesting. They're written on both each side of World War II, so you get the vision that Huxley offers at the beginning and the much darker vision that Orwell will offer after the war, and talk about their interrelationships. By and large, we tended to have the students read Brave New World, which I think is read less often, in 1984. And then we would give them sort of the 1984 piece by asking them to watch in a big group in one of the large lecture halls, the Michael Radford 1984 film production of 1984, which is one of the most faithful movie adaptations of a book that I know of. It's hard to get most of a novel into a movie. Movies are short stories translated to the screen, but that one worked really well. And more people know that story. Both Rob and I thought that even though of the principal texts that we had in the class, we could probably talk longer about Brave New World than any of the others. And that had an interesting historical progression for us too. I mean, in the 90s and aughts, it was generally the case that maybe 10% of the class you could count on as reading Brave New World and saying, that sounds pretty utopian to me. There's lots of drugs, lots of sex. What's not to like? I mean, there you had students who would defend, the position of. I don't suppose it's really the world controller's position, but the director of hatcheries would have that view. It would be that somehow yes, they could see that, and then there would be people who thought that this is just crazy. How could? But the fact that and that's I think a very good reaction. But the idea that that some people would see it as positive made for much more interesting discussions of the material. And yes, there is a sort of sybaritic side to the human condition that you would like to live in comfort. If happiness can be generated artificially, then what's wrong with that? And this is a plot of so many science fiction shows, Star Treks, where everyone is happy, and then until Kirk destroys whatever is making everyone happy. But that somehow it's morally preferable to be miserable, but for yourself. So that was fascinating. And the central debate in Brave New World of John the Savage versus the World Controller, which even if we didn't read all of Brave New World, we had people read chapter 17, which has that debate in it. I believe that, and I think Huxley agreed when he wrote Brave New World Revisited, that he gives the world controller, who's defending the state as it exists, gets the better side of that argument, right? And it's a perfectly cogent, and the world controller would have loved to spend his life on an island exploring physics, is certainly an alpha double plus character, but chooses, to sacrifice himself for everyone else's happiness, right? And that idea is such a, by making sure that everyone can be happy and that the society continues to run.
It's
Uh, I I find it very powerful.
I think Brave New World is a much deeper read than 1984. There is so much going on in terms of divorcing um, the properties that we naturally intuit make us human from societal functions, from reproductive functions, from economic functions. And so it has almost this existentialist note to it, where it was okay. So what is the point to all of this? The devil hides in Aldous Huxley. It's not very clear um, where the devil is manifesting. Whereas in 1984, it is a much clearer picture of tyranny is bad. This is what
Yeah.
unchecked tyranny leads to, um, and um, and it has this flavor which I think is like very of the times. It's uh, I impose this layer of the socialists will lead to this if unchecked, but it doesn't really examine what would happen if another alternative takes hold, right? And so I think that some of the 1984 aspects of society through surveillance capitalism, I think is just as prevalent as some of the 1984 stuff. They're obviously
Sure.
not as horrible, right? Um,
Well, but I think Orwell himself, certainly is an anti-fascist, which is not so that the right wing of the 30s, Orwell goes to Spain to fight against Franco. Um, he's certainly not any fan of Stalin's Russia, but I think his earlier aspects were against any kind of totalitarian rule, and he has a lot of opposition to the rule of England in his day. Certainly,
mhm.
when you much more broadly at his writings. So
um, it's it's interesting to me to see facets of both of these creep up in the present day, um,
yeah,
and um, and I think they are very strong critiques of this enamored relationship that we have with science that I think gets completely, a massive asterisk is added to it after the bomb and the power that we've unlocked there. There's a part of the syllabus that talks about the seduction of science. Um, and I want to preface this a little bit by saying, sort of telling you my journey through this too. So I took a bunch of philosophy classes at Stanford, and they're very much of the analytical school. Very dry, logical statement after logical statement. And as you said, it's very hard to internalize some of these concepts just because your prefrontal cortex is doing so much work just to keep track of where the instruction pointer really is. Um, and it wasn't until my senior year and then subsequently that I discovered continental philosophy and the more literary approach to revealing truth. And as you said, it is a lot more. I want to say romantic, but not in the formal way. I mean it more the like evokes emotion sense, engages your
well,
entire limbic system.
it's accessible to more of your mind and soul.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the reason I bring this up is because there is a world in which we pursue rationality, technology, falsification to the limit. Um,
Mhm.
but we're also smart enough in that path to know that at the limit, precisely, it may not be what we want, or at least it reveals that we don't know what we want. So I want that's my little preface to talk about the seduction of science, and I wanted to hear on the topic on your words.
Well, that was a key piece. I mean, I believe that it's very important for well-educated technologists to know about culture and literature and art and all those things. I mean, I believe, deeply in my soul in that aspect of the liberal arts tradition, that you can't have, technologists who are divorced from that making anything good out of the world. And we're seeing a lot of that, these days. All the university dropouts who have managed not to be sort of colored by those interesting humanistic ideas, and a single-minded pursuit of commercial success has really made for horrible situation in the world. And my hope was that by encouraging more technologists coming out of Stanford, which is certainly a place where many do come from, to have that broader vision was really why I put this course together. And when it became one of the courses in the choice, people no longer remember what the IHUM program was, but in autumn quarter, people would every first year student would take one of the classes, and there were usually on the order of 10 such. So a tenth of the class would be in each one, although there was some size variability. The Tech Visions of Utopia tended to be about 250. So was considerably more than that. It was probably, I'm not sure it was the most, consistently, certainly in some years it was the most popular first choice that students ranked. And that was because it appealed to that growing component of each entering class that was primarily interested in science and technology. And they saw this oftentimes as the easy way out, right? Oh, we get to do technology and not have to read all this stuff. It was not that.
No.
Students resist required courses and required reading all the time. I mean, I remember in the free response parts of the evaluation, and it was certainly one of the best evaluated IHUM classes. They would preface the remark in free response by saying, actually, in other words, in contrast to what I expected, I really enjoyed this class. I lot from thinking about these things in a different way. So that was my audience. I knew we were going to have mostly the techies and the Stanford techie fuzzy divide, and I wanted them to understand that there's more than one way of looking at the world that's valid. And they, we read early on the Ones Who Walk Away from Amalas, which is a refutation of utilitarianism, and we read enough of sort of Kant to say, oh, it would be child's play to come up with a thought experiment in which a pure deontological schema would fail just as badly as pure utilitarianism fails. That doesn't mean, as you mentioned, falsification and that whole notion of Karl Popper that this is what demarks science. You can't reject it because then you're left with nothing, right? You have no tools. And so in this inexact world of humanistic study, what you want to do is acquire a sufficiently rich set of tools, recognizing that there are contradictions in all of them, that allow you to think about something at a depth. And so we provide those tools early on. And then in our readings of literature, have the opportunity to talk about them, certainly in lecture and in sections, and how they relate to that more general question of how does one try to find truth in a complex, internally inconsistent world such as we live in. And getting people to recognize that. At the end of the lecture, where I talk about C.P. Snow's two cultures idea, C.P. Snow is both a novelist of note and a physicist of some note in England, and argued that the two cultures were becoming more and more isolated from one another, and that the synthesis was important. At the end of that
Mm.
lecture, I play a little interview late in life with Ursula Le Guin about, talking about how the world needs both scientists and poets as
Mm.
emblematic of the humanists. And I find that argument extremely compelling, and I think she phrases it well. And that was sort of the take home message for a skepticism, not of science. I'm not being anti-science in any way, and nor is she. Um, but to say that that's not the whole of the story. We need to understand, the human condition, and that moral philosophy that will allow us to move to a more fair, uh, more just, more peaceful world, um, that forces us to get into these complex questions, which cannot be decided by falsification. I mean, I suppose,
Mm.
the important thing to note is when Popper is defining what it means to be a science and making falsification, which of course is a controversial notion these days. Kuhn and his and later philosophers of science have certainly called that into question. But
Mm.
in those early ideas, that the way that science is differentiated from other branches of study is by this, if you can find a counterexample, you toss it out. Um, that there are so many other disciplines in which that decision procedure doesn't work, and
Mhm.
let's learn about those too.
Um, I want to run an idea by you as you were describing it. The There's a linguistic, I think, divide too between techie fuzzy in terms of how to ascribe value to different types of statements. Um,
Hmm.
the techie leans toward the quantitative, and the fuzzy leans towards the qualitative. But in either case, they are reductions of an incredibly high dimensionality space into either linguistic form, or an even more abstract notion like math or probability. Um, and I think so I was struggling with how to make a case to somebody who only sees things through measurement and quantity, to value the inherent stuff that lurks between the interpretation layers of the linguistic. And it is, I think, as simple as um, we don't want to execute a greedy algorithm on progress. And if we only operate at a very compressed level of reality, such as math or very well defined problems, then we may be optimizing for the wrong long term objective, right? And not to say that some of the practicalities that the techie side offers are to be dispensed with, because they're marvelous achievements of the human brain. But we need, the project isn't done. We need to constantly figure out ways to reduce the high dimensional space to a higher fidelity compression, such that we can ensure, or at least be more and more confident, that we're going to the right direction. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's quite astute. I think that sort of expresses one side. We need the richness of many different intellectual tools in order to make our lives fulfilling. I mean, I remember being asked, what if I had to live in a world without computers or a world without poetry, which would you
Mm.
choose? And I would jettison the computers in a heartbeat. Um, and yes, I mean, I'm particularly biased because I've been married for my entire, married life, to a poet that I value, and we we taught a course on poetry together at Stanford for 3 sessions, and the ideas that come out of literature, poetry, theater for me.
Mm.
I wouldn't, those matter so much. And they give me a sense of how people work that no amount of mathematics, Harry Seldon might be able to write down all the probability equations, foundation, and get something mostly right. Or you might be able to simulate it in the matrix so that the steak really, tasted like steak. Of course, I've
Mhm.
been a vegetarian for more than 50 years, but so that wouldn't have worked for me. But finding a way to make sure that you get those human visions. I mean,
Yeah, it's so cool. I have a fun question just because you mentioned the steak in the Matrix. If you were in the Matrix, would you eat steak?
well, who knows? I'd be controlled there, right? And
Oh,
um,
I was picturing you being one of the free agents. Like you're willing, you're
right,
wiring it to the Matrix.
yes. Well, I'm not planning on it's that's an interesting thought experiment,
Mm.
and but I don't have a good sense. You can't ever predict those conditional futures well.
Hmm.
But yeah, it was a good thought experiment. And you're right, the allegory of the cave from
Hmm.
Plato is exactly that. I mean, one of the reasons that I would include little pieces is of other readings in the reader is I include Plato's description of Atlantis because people don't know that the story of Atlantis comes from Plato. I mean, they'd be a little
Hmm.
less hard on ancient philosopher if this idea that had launched so many science fiction movies, had come from that. Or, one of the pieces that I use often in the intro CS course, I talk about linked lists, and ever since the Return of the King came out, I illustrate linked lists by showing the wonderful Peter Jackson image of the beacons of Rohan, where
Hmm.
the first beacon gets lit, and then you pass it along down the chain as and that's marvelously filmed, and then point out to people that this is in the Oresteia, in the Agamemnon. That's how Clytemnestra learns that Troy has fallen. And if you read Aeschylus on that, um, it's clear, that Tolkien lifted it. I mean, almost the same, or that that the Ring of Power from Tolkien comes from Plato. That's the Ring of Gyges. Um,
Mm.
anyway, um, but
It's all
so you got
too interesting.
yeah.
And just to add more color to the story of Atlantis is that Plato was not one to make up um, or to play kayfabe with the stuff that he wrote. In the Republic, it's very much like we know that we're talking about somewhere that doesn't exist, but with the way he talks about Atlantis, he talks about it as somewhere that did exist. Um, so I've always been, I was just gonna say I've always been called by the allure of Atlantis, and the mysteries of the hidden past. And uh, I have one last question, Eric.
Okay.
How do what do we say to someone struggling to find a vision of utopia today?
Oh, good question. Well, one of the things that I think does get people out of their hard shells thinking only about science is if you can get them to read something that really changes them, or maybe just watch something. Um, when Rob and I taught Tech Visions of Utopia, because it's a large class, we said after every class, we'll take 6 students for coffee at Bites, and sign up. You can't, if you've already done it, you can't sign up again. And so we didn't get through the whole class that way, but I'm not sure everybody would have wanted to. And when I did that, what I told, I think, people in advance was that one of the things I want to hear is, what did you read that had an influence on you? And they would think, oh, he wants, them to talk about, some great piece of literature, which was fine if, and I'd likely read that. But no, I wanted to know what really had changed them, and we'd have these wonderful discussions of the Hunger Games or Twilight or whatever it was, where, that people had really gotten into it, but they hadn't, internalized it at all. There was, they hadn't thought about those questions really. So in the last couple of years, we had a book club aspect of the course where people got to nominate a book that they thought was, really important for their understanding of the ideal society. Lois Lowry's The Giver was common in that. There were a few others. Well, I could certainly find the list of all the ones that were recommended over time. And then, we have people sign up for, vote on which ones they'd like to be part of. And then they would read in a small group with one of us, of the faculty members, discuss it. You really want people to find something that moves them. And then the idea, I think, behind a liberal education is that you then want to interrogate your reaction to figure out what it is that moved you in that, and to explore where that idea takes you. And if you can't, if people are not moved by anything, everything is going to fall on infertile ground. Those are the parable of the sower seeds that never germinate. But if you find the right, the right ways in, you can get people to address these questions in good ways. And so that, the films that we showed, I think, helped with that too. Of course, 1984 is dark as a book and just as dark as the film. It was always an autumn quarter course. So after the movie came out in 2004, we always arranged, sometime around November the 5th, a showing of V for Vendetta, which, everybody came to that in the early years after the appearance of the movie, and some people would come in cosplay. But this was something that people knew, and then let's analyze it from using the tools of this class. Man for All Seasons, so that they actually see, really amazing early pictures. It was funny because it was the John Hurt Film Festival, because John Hurt plays Richard Rich in Man for All Seasons,
and he's the sutler, isn't he? Yeah.
And in 1984, he's Winston Smith.
Oh my gosh! I don't think I had that registered. Oh, what a filmography!
Richard Burton, his last film role is O'Brien. So,
wow. Eric, this was amazing. Thank you so much for your time. I loved getting to chat about these things with you. I hope we get to sync up soon.
Too. I mean, I like talking to people who read, and you've obviously read a reasonable amount of things.
Yes, and trying to get better at it too.
Yep.
All right, sir. Thank you for the time. Don't hang up just yet. Let me end the recording, because sometimes it takes a little bit to upload. But thank you for your time. Let's do this again soon.
Yeah, I'm here, and I'm much less busy than I've ever been in my life. So,
Amazing. I will capitalize on that. All right, sir.
okay,
Thank you.
yeah, bye.